Okay, so the article I chose to read and take notes on was Making Tea, Making Japan, Cultural Nationalism and Practice by Kristin Surak. Specifically, I'll be focusing on chapter 2 of this book. Chapter 2 is titled Creating Tea, the National Transformation of a Cultural Practice. So my author, Kristin Surak, has done research on many different topics. She has done extensive research on golden passports, international migration, nationalism, and political sociology. Furthermore, her research has been translated into half a dozen languages. Presently, she is researching citizenship by investment schemes and guest work programs across the globe. She currently writes for multiple journals and is published in major academic books and intellectual journals. Those writings outlets include the London Review of Books, the New Statesman, New Left Review, and the Washington Post. Her book, Making Tea, the one I'm presenting on, won the Book of the Year award from the American Sociological Associations of the Asian section. Kristin is also an accomplished professor. She joined the London School of Economics in 2020, but before that, she was a senior lecturer at the University of London. So Kristin Surak's main statement or argument, I believe to be, is that tea captures the essence and virtues of East Asian mentality. The author chose to write this chapter in chronological order. This was the best tactic for explaining the history of tea. She started with how it got brought over to Japan, and from there she described every event that led up to the present, all the while making sure to tell her readers that the date and era she was going to talk about. One of the elements of tea that was crucial to Surak was the why. Why were people practicing the art of tea? Why was it so important? Why are groups of people gathering for tea ceremonies? Each era of tea had different answers for those questions. Those whys differed depending on what mentality the Japanese people had at that time. Their reasons for making tea always stemmed from the current virtues or goals that those aspects changed and altered with time. By explaining the history of tea this way, her readers are able to comprehend how tea embodied the essence and virtues that the Japanese valued. So the first term I was unfamiliar with was wamono. This word means Japanese made things, Japanese goods, or just the style of things. Wabi is a word used to refer to things that are fresh and simple. Chanoyu means hot water for tea. Karasuki is a type of glitzier aesthetic. The daimyo were powerful territorial lords in the pre-modern Japan who ruled most of the country from their large hereditary land holdings. Sencha is a form of tea preparation and a Chinese model that uses steeped leaves. So tea drinking in Japan begins with China. During the Tang period in China, tea began as a solid cake that would be roasted and then pulverized in boiling hot water. People would gather to drink the tea, and the guests who attended these ceremonies had a strict etiquette that they had to follow. Next comes the Song period. Instead of tea cakes came powdered tea. This method of tea combined with boiling water was whisked into a frothy foam. During this time, tea was introduced to the Japanese by monks who had been studying in China. In China, tea was being used as a bridge between people to form friendships and sociability, but this failed to carry over to the Japanese, so tea remained in the temples for religious purposes all the way up until the 15th century. But by then, tea radiated out of the temples as the elite began to host elaborate gatherings about drinking tea. During the 16th century, tea expanded even further, reaching merchants, and this further expanded the utensils, aesthetic standards, and preparation procedures surrounding the tea gatherings. In these smaller merchant spaces, tea was about intimacy and friendship. Aristocratic gatherings focused more on the value of objects as opposed to tea itself. Hosts also began to play a bigger role in tea ceremonies, shifting it from an event to a practice. The guests were now an active audience that promoted networking and community. The tea ceremony of the late 16th and early 17th century was a central venue for the production and reproduction of social and cultural capacities. that could then be played into political influence or economic capital. So then we get into the Momoyama era. This era developed the tea ceremonies into an even further political tool. Tea utensils served as war prizes, and the tea gatherings marked military victories. This era involved a lot of war and violence, which caused tea to become a medium for negotiating rivalries, a tool for demonstrating wealth and power, and a space for forging important cross-clan contacts. These aspects and values progressed under the influence of two daimyos who reformed Chinoyu in a manner more suited for warriors. This enforced social rank and hierarchy. With the beginning of the 18th century, a new daimyo stepped into place and fought for economic reforms. He wanted the role of tea in Japan to maintain proper status and bring harmony back to society. Next came the Tokugawa era. A rival to matcha-based Chinoyu emerged called sencha. This was a form of tea stemming from a Chinese models that used steeped leaves and was deeply associated with Confucianism. Sencha was seen as a freer, more relaxed form of tea, leaving behind the corruptions that had previously come with Chinoyu. The matcha tea ceremony was also exclusively male-dominant, but in the mid-18th century, elite women could learn some rules of the etiquette. The guidebooks given to the women gave them social approval for enjoying tea, but did not give them the understanding of the ceremony's essence. Tea ceremony continued to grow and gain even more popularity. Soon there were big enough tea ceremonies that they were called gala tea ceremonies. It was said that no aspiring company or individual could afford to be ignorant of Chinoyu. In 1896, national pride was at an all-time high because of Japan's victory in the Sino-Japanese War. Tea utensils were now seen as works of art that were linked to a long national history of their noble past. Chinoyu was now being discussed in books and intellectual circles. In the Meiji years, Japan adopted a modern educational system that had great success. Boys and girls were required to attend primary school, and this brought new reforms to the women. Girls were to learn about the arts, such as training in tea ceremonies, flower arrangements, singing, poetry, calligraphy, you name it. This purpose was so they could be good wives and wise mothers. Roles had been reversed. It was rare for tea ceremonies to be included in boys' textbooks, but all of a sudden it was thoroughly taught in girls. Tea at this point was often displayed as having nationalizing effects and promoting national narratives. Previous textbooks provided the full history of tea, but in the early 20th century, tea manuals depicted it as an ancient pastime of the elite, a method of social exchange, and a form of manners. Writers and thinkers had all the power in this reconfiguration of tea in post-feudal Japan. So they transformed tea into a touchstone of Japanese nationalism. Tea offered the means to cultivate the ethical and etiquette capacities that define the nation. 3 years later, the Book of Tea was published. This was an elaborate analysis of the Japanese tea culture. It became a huge success in the US and nationwide. By the 20th century, the understanding of tea as the quintessential aspect of Japanese art became common sense, just knowledge. Nothing is more closely associated with the arts and crafts of Japan than Chinoyu. So I thought Kristin Surak's argument was convincing. I felt this way because of the amount of detail she provided for every aspect of the tea ceremony's history. She also did an extensive amount of research in order to fully understand and be able to translate to others exactly why and how tea was such a huge part of the Japanese mentality. I was also able to easily digest what she was saying. And for words I was unfamiliar with, she usually would give a short description of what they meant within the text. If I were to make this same claim, I would use the same approach as Surak. I think the only successful way to cover every aspect of the history of tea is to do it in a chronological timeline-like fashion. This way I would be able to stay organized within the long history and cover everything that I needed to. And that's it.